possible. Okay, let's begin the talk. The title of my presentation today is Diversification as Stratification, WorkStyle Reform and its Consequences in Inequality in Japan. As the title already suggests that, well, diversification, I mean, people tend to talk that, in WorkStyle Reform, it's a hatarakikata no tayoka, it's like a diversification of work style, diversification of employment career track, and things like that. And the term diversification sometimes misleadingly suggests that diversified elements are somehow equal. But I would like to argue that it's not really true. Diversification is actually a stratification, and it is often a facilitation of new forms of inequality in Japan. Okay, here today I have 4 segments in my talk today. First, I would like to introduce just briefly about what's going on in WorkStyle Reform today, or in the last, not really today, it's like the last 2-3 years, or even 10 years in the last decade. And I would like to introduce the concept of company citizenship in the second segment. It is an institutional legacy of Japanese employment relations. And I would argue that that specific type of citizenship impacted greatly on the reform process and create new inequality in Japan. And I would like to pick up 2 examples today in the reform, as in the third segment of the talk. I'd like to pick up the reforms. First, the revision of part-time work law, the revision of the Parttime Work or something like that. And the second example is the making of something called restricted regular employment that is quite popular today in as an employment practice today. In Japanese, it's called Gentilization. So all of these are the efforts to create diversity in Japan, or to fix the gap of regular and non-regular employment in Japan, and also in an attempt to create new diversity in employment relations in Japan. But I would like to argue that pretty much all of these attempts fall into the cementing of inequality in Japan. And I finally would like to conclude in such a way. So this is the basic structure of today's talk. So here, this is the first page of, this is not my slide actually. This is the slide prepared by the Ministry of Health and Labor and Welfare. It looks like that introduces what WorkStyle Reform is aiming at. And it's a typical bureaucrat's PowerPoint slide that, they don't expect anybody to actually read through it. So it's a very interesting slide. So I'd like to summarize this for you. There are 2 major pillars in a WorkStyle Reform, they claim. And first one is actually the working time reforms. And second one is actually the equality between regular and non-regular employments. Let me go slightly more in detail. WorkStyle Reform, as far as I see, is a mixture of deregulatory and re-regulatory reforms of employment relations. And I have to say they tend to be liberal, that because they emphasize individual choice and autonomy. Let me pick up the first example, working time regulation. It has the element of social regulation of overtime work. Surprise, surprise that Japan really didn't have any social regulation of overtime work, because, I mean, there was a regulation, but there was a big loophole due to the existence of Saburoku Kyote. It's like a agreement between employers and workers based on the article number 36 of Labor Standard Acts. They can agree upon any lengths of overtime work at each workplaces. That is a big loophole of overtime work. So from, I guess, last year, there's finally set out the real social regulation of overtime work in Japan. That was the 45 hours per month and maximum 80 hours and 100 hours per month, which was the target of the big criticism from labor scholars, and 50 hours per year. That was the social regulative part of the reforms. But at the same time, they introduced the white collar exemption. That's a big deregulatory reform and a work style reform. So that is why I said that this is a mixture of re-regulation and deregulation at the same time in the work style reform. The second pillar is about equality between employment statuses, especially between regular employment and non-regular employment. And that includes the revisions of part-time work law, that includes the principle of equal pay for equal work. And there was a revision of the temporary dispatched work law. There was a revision of the labor contract law in the last decade and a half. And there was also the establishment of the Gentilization, restricted regular employees, in order to cope with the requirements of better work-life balance, and also in order to reduce the gap between regular and non-regular employment. And today, the focus of the talk will be about here. I would like to pick up the revision of the part-time work law, and also the establishment of Gentilization and how they are influenced by the concept I propose as an accompanied citizenship, and it resulted in an inequality in employment relations in Japan. The question is, do these reforms achieve equality and diversity? And no, they generated status stratification. So here, I hear that most of the audiences today at the lunch seminar are not necessarily sociologists, not necessarily economists. Many of them may be practitioners in employment and labor issues. So you may not be really necessary. I may not be very interested in this slide, but I'm a sociologist. So I anyway have to talk about this a little bit in order to set out a sociological context of this study I'm presenting today. In order to talk about inequality, sociologists cannot get rid of the concept class. There's a class analysis. And usually we devise the class concept like employer, capitalist, and blue-collar workers, skilled and unskilled, white-collar workers, managerial and non-managerial, and remaining categories such as self-employed. And we basically use these 5 basic categories to describe, observe, structure of inequality in society, and measure how unequal the society is and such. So class isn't a major concept in sociology. There is an assumption that the individual contract, regardless of tradition or Marxist or Weberian, but for sociologists, it's a very universal framework. You can use class concept anywhere in the world. You can use this class concept in America, France, Germany, Japan, anywhere, UK, of course. But ignoring status elements, in Japan, big chunk of inequality is actually explained by status concepts such as firm size, gender, and employment statuses. Much better explanation than class analysis. So there's a task for sociologists to come up with a better framework to kind of supplement class analysis or fix the class analysis. And there's a challenge in that way. Another a strand of thought in inequality study in sociology is the studies that focuses on the concept of status, especially in this field of employment and labor. For instance, Professor Nomura Masami from Tohoku University, he retired from Tohoku University, and I very much admire is proposed terms such as kaisha mibunse. It's like a difference of the kaisha works as a mibun, and also the employment statuses among the employees looks like a feudal status in Japan. It's really rigid and hard to break through. And also Morioka, Professor Morioka, he just passed away last year, two years ago. Also, I admire so much, proposed the term koyo mibun shakai, also somehow suggesting that Japan still carries the element of feudal status inequality in today's world. As I said, I admire both of the arguments very much. I like them very much too. But at the same time, as a framework of the analysis of social inequality, these concepts such as kaisha mubunse, koyo mibun shakai cannot be applied to any of the societies at all. So it is actually implicitly, they're not clear about it, but it's implicitly a Japan exceptionalism. Does not provide ground for comparative study. So, well, my idea is, well, I have to go somewhere in between these strands of thought. And there is such a strand of thought in sociology or study of social policy or industrial relations. And I would like to emphasize the importance of the focus on labor relations or employment relations, and also the concept of industrial citizenship in order to understand the inequality structure, rigid and durable inequality structure in modern contemporary capitalist society. For instance, Michael Mann, Bruce Western, and Wolfgang Streeck, all sociologists, say that collective negotiation of industrial relations supports the survival of tradition, embeds status into contract. Another example is like Anthony Giddens. He says that the class struggle is the media to expand citizenship rights through which status conception is woven into. What they want to say is class struggle between workers and employers, which is, and also the intervention of state to the struggle, is the common feature of capitalist societies. Any capitalist society has this element. And this process of struggle actually interpret the conception of traditional status and re-embed it into the idea of, in particular, wages. Who should get more or who should get less? Or the social rights, who should be entitled to something, who should not be entitled to something. That kind of gender judgment is influenced by this traditional sense of status. And that traditional sense of status is embedded into, through this process, as a socially specific, society-specific definition of the membership or collectivity of workers. So focusing on labor relations and employment relations is very, very important and effective because it is a common feature of capitalist societies, but also it carries the society-specific status culture in the field of employment. And that status conception is realized as something called industrial citizenship in modern capitalist societies that is proposed by Thomas Humphrey Marshall in 1950. Industrial citizenship reflects labor's claim on living standards, on social rights in negotiation with state and firm. So it is very important to focus on the political and cultural negotiation between labor and employers and state. And also it defines status rights and duties, the norms and the taken for granted notion that enable the contract between employers and employees. That actually, the norms set up the employment status, and that attaches certain status duties, status rights and duties to employment status. And that is historically constructed secondary citizenship of an industrial society that sets standards of inequality and fairness. So for instance, equal pay for equal work in Western societies like in Germany is a typical example of the specific sense of equality and fairness that is applied to the certain collectivities, well, membership to occupational labor unions, for example, or occupational health insurance and pension system that is based on certain collectivities, occupation, and here the specific rights and duties are attached to that status. That is called industrial citizenship. So what I wanted to do today is first to introduce what is industrial citizenship in Japan and how it is created, focusing on the power relations between employers and workers and how state intervene into the process, which is in the title here, the making of the status of regular employment and company citizenship in Japan. I call the Japanese version of industrial citizenship company citizenship. So here I'd like to talk about the institutionalization of regular employment in Japan in the post-war period. Believe it or not, Japanese labor unions were very, very strong right after the World War II. They established here, I would like to focus on two things. The establishment of seniority wage system and corporate welfare schemes attached to it, and also the abolishment of the discrimination against blue-collar workers. So especially between 1945 and 1950, of course, there is a discussion that until when labor unions were really strong, but there was a support of the United States up until at least 1947. So Japanese labor union movements experienced a surge. And seniority wage system is the biggest achievement during that period that achieved the security of employment and security of wage. So it's a big achievement for them. And corporate welfare schemes are attached to the seniority wage system. And that was supported by preferential tax treatment and welfare policies by developmental state that treat large firms favorably. So today it is still so in Japan. And the seniority wage system has another very important aspect, that is the type of family wage based on the strong male breadwinner ideology that exclude women from employment and labor. So second biggest achievement is the abolishment of the discrimination against blue-collar workers that made jugyoin and shain status in Japan. Well, Japanese people identify themselves as a jugyoin or a member of certain company. I'm a Sony man or I'm working for Hitachi. That kind of attachment is due to this achievement of the labor unions in Japan. So rights described above, seniority wage, corporate welfare, became accessible to both white-collar workers and blue-collar workers, and class in the Western sense became unimportant here in Japan. And of course, it established, it achieved an exclusion of women from regular employment status. Then there was a counterattack by employers that gradually established management prerogative at Japanese companies. That is still ongoing in Japan today. Labor unions changed orientation during the rapid economic growth in between 1950s and 1970s, from political participation to economic redistribution. Institutionalization of Shunto Spring Offensive is a typical example of this change, and also experience of the rise of living standard and an upward social mobility legitimatized the change among workers. And during that period, labor unions began to withdraw from labor management, and that shaped the list of duties more specifically in the Japanese employment relations. So they withdrew from the decisions of a personnel evaluation, or also the mobility decisions, rotation decisions. Such decisions are in the hands of employers rather than workers from the time of oil crisis. And there began a labor intensification and growing importance of ability to be flexible. That's a term by Professor Kumazawa, another scholar who I admire a lot. And I'll explain what is ability to be flexible in the next slides. And here comes an oil crisis. And the labor union claimed employment security and living standards of maintenance of these. But I mean, the weakness of the Japanese labor union is well known, that it's established based on the company, not on an occupational basis. So if the employers claim that, will be bankrupted, then there's no chance for labor unions to claim fiercely about their requirement. Then total mobilization became possible, growing legitimacy of the logic of efficiency of the companies, increasingly cooperative labor unions, for example, the Saburoku Kyote that I mentioned in the first slide, and the creation of company man, the caricature of the hardworking Japanese workers, fully subordinated workers who can prioritize company matters over individual matters. So towards the 1980s, I think there was a completion of the institutionalization of company citizenship in Japan. Rights of secure employment and wage are associated with the deepened requirements of duty, and those duty including the accepting rotation, transfer, multitasking, flexible overtime work, including unpaid overtime work, and the very specific mobility patterns such as shukko and tenseki under management prerogative. And this is something that economists may call psychological contract, but I would like to say that's a Japanese style of labor contract embedded in the specific population and status conception in this society. So this is the company citizenship I call. So here, the political and cultural negotiation by company-based cooperative union, management prerogative, and state's commitment to economic growth created this status. And the rights include stable employment and wages, access to corporate welfare, but duties include submissive attitudes to job rotation, transfers, flexible overtime work, unpaid overtime work, that Kumazawa called ability to be flexible. That is taken for granted. If you're regular workers, you are naturally required to perform these flexibilities. And of course, this citizenship is supported by the strong male breadwinner assumption in the society. And my argument today is Japan's experiences of deregulation and deregulation of labor markets, including the efforts of work-style reform, were and are channeled by this institutional legacy of company citizenship. So 2 examples of the influence of company citizenship on the efforts of reforms. First one is a revision of part-time work law. First one is 2008, and second one 2014, and there are a couple of others afterwards. But all the revisions are pretty much, I would argue that on the same line of argument, based on the same line of argument. The second one is the establishment of restricted regular employment, what I call RRE, Gentilization, in the last 2 decades. Okay, revision of the part-time work law. The reasons of the revision is the growing recognition of the inequality between regular and non-regular workers after the deregulation from the 1990s to the mid-2000s. And there was a social argument of kaksa shakai, gap society, and there's a growing recognition about the inequality between these employment statuses. And also the growing recognition on the increasing overlap of work between regular and non-regular workers. Since there is a growing number of non-regular workers, some of them began to take core functions at the organization, and those workers began to recognize that what they do is actually not so much different from what regular employees do. Such a recognition, growing recognition on the overlap. But the very big one is the court decision on the necessity of equal pay for equal work in Japan. That is the case of Maruko Kei Hoki, and the court used the term equal pay for equal work, Doitsurodo Doitshingin Gensek, for the first time in Japanese history in 1996. That triggered, that was the direct enforcement for government to handle this issue in the policy field. So the Ministry of Labor immediately established two study groups on inequality between regular and non-regular employment in 1998 for the first and 2000 for the second. So discussion at these two study groups set out the foundations of or the framework of the revisions afterwards, generated two principles of inequality, equality, and also more importantly, the distinction between regular and non-regular employment, which was actually at the workplace level used differently or not quite so clear in Japan. The first study group is the study group of management of part-time workers. They nicknamed themselves as a monosashiken. This is a spectacular nickname after, actually. It's a monosashi in Japanese is a measurement. They actually measured how to measure the distance between regular and non-regular employment. And they submitted the final report on 2000. The goal of this study group was recognizing that Western European type of equal pay for equal work is impossible in Japan because there is no occupational union or occupational labor markets. So the goal is to articulate the realistic standards to figure out when regular and non-regular should be treated equally. So that was the goal of this study group. And the Partoken, the official name in Japanese is the Parto Rodo Kenkyukai, submitted the final report to the Ministry of Labor in 2002. The goal is to put the standards proposed by Monosashiken into the form of law. So these two consecutive study groups were actually headed by the same professor, Professor Sato from Tokyo University, did the articulation of the difference between regular and non-regular employment and the conditions when they should be treated equally. And as far as I read the transcripts of and reports by these study groups, well, what I have to really say here is the very strong standard employment centrism in these study groups. They took company citizenship for granted and defined when non-regular workers should not be treated unequally. Two principles include Kinto Shogu, equal pay for equal work, which only in a rare occasion happened in Japan, and also the obligation of equal treatment, Kinko Shogu, well-balanced treatment that is often problematized in Japanese workplaces these days. For example, like application of commuting allowance to non-regular workers, that kind of treatment, I mean, employers need to make an effort to apply to those allowances to non-regular workers too. That's the effort of balanced treatment. So now the revised part-time law reflected the argument in these two study groups. The conditions when non-regular workers should not be treated unequally appeared in the revised part-time law enacted in 2008. So what this means is when it is okay to treat them unequally, right? The same thing, that's the flip side of the coin. The other side of the coin, the same coin. So whose areas of job and responsibility are comparative to regular workers, employers need to treat non-regular workers equally. Whose term of contract is unlimited or repeating limited term contract, then employers need to treat them equally. And whose job and assignment may change or rotate in the same scope as regular employees, then employers need to treat them equally. Otherwise, if they are not comparable or the same, not in the same scope, they can treat them differently. So I'd have to say the message is quite clear. Should duties be performed in order for non-regular workers to be entitled to rights of company citizenship. So if you do not perform, if you do not commit to perform the flexibility requirements, it is okay that non-regular employees do not have an access to the rights that regular employees have. So I'd have to say that's the limit of equality by company citizenship. That's like the limit of equal pay for equal work in Western European societies, where equality cannot go beyond the limit of occupation, of course. So it's pretty much the same equivalent of this in Western society. But there's a lot of requests, probably from employers and probably maybe from workers too, that we should be more specific when it is same, when they are not same. A law was revised in 2014, enacted in 2015, and there was a revision in 2018, I guess. But I think this is a very interesting guideline proposed by or published by the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare. I'm sorry, this isn't written in Japanese, but there's a two line of questions employers have to ask themselves to figure out when regular and non-regular should be treated equally. First, roughly compare the contents of work, 職種を比較. So if they do sales occupation or gym clerical occupation, if they are roughly the same, you have to raise second question. Compare the main contents of work. Here, can you see my arrow? Okay. Here's a comparison of part-time workers and regular workers. 接客, it's like a handling of the customer. The same, they share the responsibility. Reiji is like a punching a number in the calculator. That is the same. Shinadashi is bringing commodity from stock to sales hall. The same. But the part-time workers were responsible for cleaning, probably after the hours. And regular workers are responsible for handling of the claims by customers and also making an order to headquarters. So there's a lot of differences. But if they are roughly, if they're the same, you have to ask another question. Compare the responsibility in full, and also the expectation of responsibility should be the question. For example, you compare the scope of work and the scope of responsibility. If you have a quota of responsibility to sales, how much is it? You can compare the quota between regular and non-regular workers. So expectation is also on the agenda. If you compare the expectation, if it is different, you don't need to treat them equally. Okay, second line of question is the flexibility question. First one is, do they accept regional transfer? Well, you can immediately come up that the non-regular workers usually don't need to accept this flexibility. That is why they chose to be part-time workers. So this is like for me, it's like a real strange question to ask from the start, but they need to ask anyway, accepting regional transfer. And if they both accept, then you need to ask the scope of regional transfer. Do they accept local transfer or national transfer or overseas transfer? It is surprising that if any part-time workers accept overtime transfer, but overseas transfer, but if they are completely the same, you need to ask another question. Do they accept rotation, changes of assignments? And fourth question, compare the range and scope of rotation, assignment changes. So here, what they do is actually this revised law formalized the inequality. Company citizenship legitimizes status differences rather than realizing inequality, right? These are the components of duties of company citizenship. They are articulated in the law and formalized and an inequality between regular and non-regular employees. So that's the story of the revision of part-time work law. The second story is the Gentilization, restricted regular employment. They are treated as regular employees. I mean, I assume that everyone in this room at least heard of Gentilization. And Gentilization are called seishain because they are hired on the basis of unlimited term contract. That's their definition. That's Japanese employers and government's definition of regular employees. If they are entitled to unlimited term contract, they are seishain. But with some conditions or restrictions on the management to achieve flexibilities. For instance, Kinmuchi Gentei Seishain, they have restriction on regional transfer. They move within a certain region or area. They don't need to accept the flexibility to move beyond that restriction. Second one is Shokumu Gentei Seishain. They need to perform in certain work area, job area, not across to other functions. So that basically means that they don't need to accept rotation. And also the restriction on working time. There are two types, for instance, like a very short-time part-time employees, and also those who do not accept overtime work. So there's a jikan gente that restrict the potential flexibility that employers can get out from the efforts of workers in Japan. And this is not at all new. They are treated as a new phenomenon, but if you think about ippanshoku, that was created in 1980s, is a career track for young women with regional and work area restrictions. So they are a direct predecessor of Gentei Seishain today. It's just completely gendered. So ippanshoku is the direct predecessor, I'd have to argue. And GPT survey. GPT is the Japan Institute of Labor and Policy and Training, and have done a survey in 2010. Also, they have done pretty much the same survey in 2018, but 2010 survey is fabulous in terms of they include ippanshoku as a type of Gentei Seishain. So a little less than half of the sample firms answered that they used any kind of Gentei Seishain, and 32.8% said they use ippanshoku, and 11.6% they use a regional restriction, regular employment, 23 work area, 5.7 working time. So centering around ippanshoku restriction, like regional restriction and work area restriction, there are a growing number of companies that use restricted regular employment. The reasons of establishment, the growing recognition on inequality between regular and non-regular employees, and also the growing recognition on the necessity to improve work-life balance in order to utilize women workforce in Japan, facing a labor shortage. And also the labor contract law in 2013 mandated companies to offer unlimited term contract to a part of non-regular workers who have long enough tenure at a company. That was, that came to the first 5-year limit on the April 2018. So the companies needed to set out certain rules in order to cope with that situation. So restricted regular employment established in 2000, and the government initiative to further spread the practice in the 2010. So here's when it is the timing of introducing restricted regular employment from 2010 GPT survey. Since it included ippanshoku, 1/3 of the companies said they established it from 1980s, but the majority established the restricted regular employment system in 2000s. So I'd like to introduce one case here that gives us a very interesting story, how company citizenship impacted on the creation of the restricted regular employment. This is a case of a large manufacturer in food industry, I call Food A. The company had just simply a two-track system in employment. Career track regular workers and non-regular workers called partner workers. But from 2017, they added two tracks in order to improve work-life balance and also attract good workers from local labor market. First was to establish chief partner track to hire non-regulars in core functions with long tenure at Food A. This is basically to deal with the revision of the labor contract law that I just mentioned in the last slide. And second one is the career track. And a career track is divided into national track and area track. In order to establish two tracks, Food A used two logics: scope of regional transfer and scope of organizational responsibility. They actually provided two tables, but they're completely the same. So I could actually merge them with no problem at all. So this is the table. So at the top, you can see scope of regional transfer, overseas transfer, national transfer. You don't need to transfer without moving, and job change across sections. And you only need to accept the change within a section. And if you take a look at national track employers at the top, they need to accept, they're expected to accept overseas transfer, national transfer, transfer without moving, or any transfer they're expected to accept. But area track employees are not expected to accept overseas transfer and national transfer. They only need to accept transfer without moving in certain region, or a job change across sections and job change within a section. And if you take a look at partner employees at the bottom, they don't need to accept any mobility decision other than the transfer within the section, possibly job change across sections in the same office building or something like that. If you take a look at scope of organizational responsibility, business decision at the company level, that also indicates that how high you can move up the career ladder. You can be expected to make a business decision at the company level. National track employees are expected to take such a decision-making role if that person is good enough to move up the career ladder. And they're also expected to make a business decision at the department level. They're expected to make a higher decision at sectional level, decision to handle irregular situation at everyday workplaces, and also the higher decision to handle routine operations and irregular situation, and et cetera, et cetera. And partner employees only need to accept to make a decision to handle routine operations. So now Food A only had two career track, but now they have 4 career tracks to cope with the requirements of work-life balance and also attract good workers from regional or labor market. And interesting thing is that the process to establish 2 tracks was to clarify the duties expected to the tracks. Personnel department stated that we should assign national and overseas transfer more to national track employees. Otherwise, it is unfair. And by establishing these 4 tracks, different salary table and career prospects are applied to different tracks. For instance, with regard to the wage, 80 to 90% of the wage to regular employees is applied to restricted regular employees. If you take a look at the graphs here, the darkest one, black bar, is the average of the restricted regular employment. And all other bars represent the different types of restricted regular employment. And here, X axis represent the percentage of the level of wage of restricted regular employment. So less than 70%, 70 to 80%, and less than 100. If I added up these numbers, the black ones, a little more than 70% of the companies said the they assign lower wages to restricted regular employees. And it's interesting to see that the 13.4% applied pretty much the same wages to compared to regular employees, and little applied higher one. And of course, you can see in this table, lower expectation of upward mobility is applied to restricted regular employees. So what does the establishment of the restricted regular employees achieve? It's a diversification of regular employee employment under the frame of equality and work-life balance. But it is in fact a stratification based on the degree of commitment to the duties of company citizenship. Stratification based on scope of flexible mobility and scope of organizational responsibility. And restricted regular employment attached to lesser labor conditions. That is why I'm saying it's not just a diversification, it's a stratification. So, and it was a strategy by employers, but it was largely supported by labor unions and workers. It is reported that workers at Food A said it is unfair if those who accept regional transfer and those who don't are treated equally. Actually, the people in the personnel department stated that they created these two tracks in the career track because there was a complaint already from workers that, well, the tendency that some people tend to be asked more about the regional transfer than some others. Some people actually reject the requirement of mobility and still treat it equally with others, and they said it's unfair. So it is to cope with the sense of unfairness among the workers. So these are the two examples I wanted to show today. So conclusions. We observed, analyzed a revision of the part-time work law and also the establishment of the restricted regular employment. And both developments were contoured by the norms of company citizenship. And company citizenship was first taken for granted, but today they began to be articulated in the laws and rules of labor management practices. And they provide legitimate inequality, categorical division, like regular employment, non-regular employment, and also the national career track and area career track, and inequality based on company citizenship is to be seen legitimate, even creating new inequalities based on their sense of fairness. And the distance between regular and non-regular was measured by the logic of company citizenship, and stratification by company citizenship in the case of restricted regular employment is seen as diversity rather than inequality. So in order to really solve the problem of inequality, I'd argue that it is really necessary to relativize company citizenship and effectively criticize standard employment centrism. And we have to doubt that the principles, company citizenship, that we believe to contribute to equality and fairness actually do the opposite. So we have to really abandon the principles that we relied on during the rapid economic growth, which is doing harm rather than good in today's society. So this is just a summary table that I presented today. And this is a little advertisement. Today's presentation is just a part of my book that will be published January next year. I just sent the final proof to the publisher so that it will be in print as soon as possible. And the title is 雇用関係の社会的不平等、産業的シティズンシップの形成展開としての構造変動. That will be published from Yuhikaku. So if you don't have any problem reading Japanese, I appreciate it if you buy one. to read more carefully about my arguments. Okay, thank you very much for attention. I greatly appreciate it, and I welcome any comments and questions.